So this is the Grant for A19 and Match webinar. And as I said, Lori and Kelly are both in the room with me this morning to make sure I get everything covered. So the goals for today are to cover both the expenditure reimbursement process and match documentation, and also make sure you're aware of the resources on our website at gearup.wa.gov. Just an update on contracts. The contracts are signed by the superintendents. You all have new interagency agreement numbers for your A19s, so please make sure that you are referencing the correct number, and if you're using the A19 template that Lori sent, then that's already included for you. So just make sure you're using those new templates. Those did go out to the coordinators and fiscal contacts that Lori has, so if for some reason you did not receive it, please contact Lori and she can make sure that you have those. Then, as we discussed at the November workshops, the contract is your obligated scope of work. So those are the things that you're contractually obligated to complete, and any changes to that must be approved. If your superintendent's office has not shared a copy of the contract with you, you can also request that from me or Lori, and we can pass that on to you as an electronic document. Also, I know it's really important to fiscal folks to know the CFDA number. That is a federal number that's used to track grant funds. And so the number for this program is 84.334S. Please share that if you need to. Just a note about records retention or archiving requirements. All of the GearUp financial and participation records must be retained by your district for 6 years after the end of a grant cycle. It is a very long retention period. It is the common retention period for all federal grants, so your district should be accustomed to that. Not absolutely everything must be retained, but anything related to financial match, expenditures included, and participation records must be retained. So please work with your district to make sure you have a way to track and keep those records. I think the most important thing to remember is that everything that we're going to cover today is provided to you in our coordinator manual. And so there's the link to that so you can review all of the instructions in detail. Today we will cover a lot of detail, and the slides have a lot of narrative included. They're very word heavy, but always for your reference, you should go back to the grant management module. Grant management module on our website to review instructions. You can print out the manual pieces there if that is helpful to you. Also, as a reminder, we always want you to go to the website to check for the most current forms. So we do update those frequently. Last week I updated the travel guidelines just once more. So please make sure you check that frequently for any changes. And all of the changes will be highlighted with a revision date, so they're easy to find. So starting with the dates to consider when you're starting this reimbursement and or match process, here is an example. When the September fiscal month closes, so every school district closes their fiscal month at a different time, so it's not necessarily standard, but it's usually in the week or so following the end of that month. So a September fiscal month would usually close sometime early in October. And once that month closes, your district office or your business office will need to print what we call the transaction recap for September expenses. So that transaction recap is a summary of all charges billed to GearUp for the single month of September. It's a pretty standard report. I think it's something business offices are very used to printing, and they've probably already sent up an account code to charge GearUp expenses too. Then the EDF is the expenditure detail form, and the A19 date is September. So for those September expenditures, the date on your A19 and expenditure detail form are September, because that's the month they were incurred and paid. Then those expenses are due to us by the week of October 25th. So as long as we receive everything from you the week of October 25th, so you have a few days leeway there, you remain in compliance with the grant requirements. And then we have 30 days to process that A19 and pay it once it's complete. So as an example, if Lori asks you on day 15 of that 30 days for some clarification, and you don't respond within that 30 days, then we still have 30 days to pay you once we hear back from you and resolve that issue. So that is important that you get back to us in a timely manner, because your district is counting on that reimbursement and probably would like it as soon as possible since the expenses were already paid. So it's important that you get back to us within a few days of Lori's inquiries. So as I said, that transaction recap summarizes everything that is paid in a given month, and we ask that it's printed for a single month after the close. So we don't want to receive with an A19 September, October, and November expenses. For that September A19, we would only want September expenses included in that. And that should only be done after those bills have been paid and checks were issued. So we don't want to see any outstanding or pending payments in that expenditure detail report or the transaction recap. So the first step, printing the transaction recap. Sorry about that. I'm going to just pause for a second. So then the next step is to collect the invoices and backup for everything listed on that transaction recap. So the transaction recap will be your guide for every step going forward. And so you want to collect the itemized invoices or receipts that document each of those expenditures. So for example, for any travel expenses, you would have a travel reimbursement form. You might also call that in your district a travel expenses voucher or an expense reimbursement form, or whatever your district calls that form for reimbursing employees for travel. You also will collect any accompanying receipts. So if you had parking, for example, attached to that travel reimbursement form, we would need that documentation as well. For payroll, the transaction recap is the only backup that we require. Timesheets should be retained by your district, and we'll talk a little bit more about time and effort in a few minutes. And they may be audited at any time. So, but we do only need that transaction recap as the backup for payroll. Then we really only want invoices and receipts. We do not want, and please do not send, purchase orders, timesheets, packing lists, requisitions, participation logs, order confirmation, check vouchers, on and on and on. We really only need invoices and or receipts. I know sometimes they're called both things, so that's why I reference both ways. It's paper that we don't need, it's copying that you don't need to do, it's time getting those things and copying them that you don't need to spend. So please pay attention to that list of what we do not need. So now you've done the transaction recap and you have the backup documentation. The next step is to complete the expenditure detail form. And this really helps you get all of that information organized. The form summarizes who was paid and why the money was spent and how much you spent. You also will include how many students, family, or staff attended any events that are included in that activity summary, especially when there is food or other items provided to those individuals. When you're recording how many participants you had on the expenditure detail form, you will want to include both GearUp and non-GearUp students. You'll also want to include staff. For example, if you have a family event, it might say something like 40 GearUp students, 10 non-GearUp students, 15 family members, and 5 staff participated. And so we do need that level of detail, and we have some really good examples in the coordinator manual of how to do that. Quite often, we don't get the detail that we need in this form, so please review the examples that we have in the manual so that you are providing enough information. A lack of information means more time spent on follow-up for Lori and consequently for you. So the better job you do on this form, the less follow-up we will all need to do and the less time we have to spend on it. So then as you're organizing it, this is our suggestion that you go through and from the transaction recap, separate the items into the correct categories. So the first section on the form is salary, wages, and benefits. So that is any time that you pay people for work that they have done, and it should include their benefits. The next section is specifically for staff travel and professional development. So that's any time you go to GearUp West or any of our workshops, AVID training, AP Summer Institute, or any other professional development that GearUp is paying for. It does not include staff travel for field trips. Please take note of that. We don't consider that staff travel for professional development. That's a student service. So all of the student services are included in goods and services, and I think of this as the stuff that's related to students and field trips, but not transportation, and then any technology. So it's the things that you buy or the services that you buy to support your program. Then finally, the last category is student transportation. This would include all field trips, district vehicles, buses, and vans that are used for any purpose other than professional development. Going to pause to take a question. Actually, we have 3 questions. So the first question is, when prorating expenditures, are they prorated to a whole number or to a tenth or a hundredth? I think given that we're using dollars, we would round to the nearest penny, I suppose. That will keep us the most accurate. So yeah, to dollars and cents. The next question says, would it be possible to gain access to all 3 Spokane schools portals? I'm the accountant for the grant and don't always have the details on students and staff that attended an event. It may be helpful to be able to access the portal and take a look at the activity details. That's a determination for your district to make, and if they feel that that's important for you to have, then yes, we would not question that. So please work with your GearUp coordinators to see if they would like you to have that, if that would be helpful. Also, what most districts do to resolve that issue is there is a monthly meeting with the coordinator and the person doing the A19 to make sure that all those details are shared. So that is another option. Third question, at a family event where there are younger siblings that attend school, we have them sign in and then put them on the expenditure detail form. Yes, and we'll cover this, I think, a little bit later, and I think we covered it in the portal webinar yesterday, but we do want to track and keep a record of everyone who participates in GearUp activities whether they are GearUp students or not. And so if there are siblings that attend, then yes, they can sign in. Of course, if they're 3 or 4, they're not going to sign in, but you can include them in your count and maybe track that with a note by the parent on the sign-in sheet. That would be completely acceptable. And then you would include them in your family member count for the event so we can track food expenses. Another question, so what if a chaperone and a student went on a trip to the GearUp conference in Washington, D.C. or a college? Then is the chaperone's airfare under student travel or the staff section? Great question, thank you, Anne. So a staff member attending the GearUp conference in D.C., that is considered professional development, and so it would go there, and the students' travel would go in goods and services. So they would be separated that way. However, a college visit would be considered a field trip, so all the expenses would go in goods and services and student transportation. It's a good clarification, thank you. So moving on to the actual expenditure detail form, and I'm sorry, it's really awkward for me to share that form with you here, so please take some time to look at it once we're done today, if at all possible. But there are 4 columns on the form. The first is the vendor name, and that is the name of the person or the business that actually received the payment, so who was paid, and that's always detailed on the transaction recap. It tells you exactly who was paid. Then there's a purpose column, and what we're asking there is what did you spend the money on, what was the purpose, and then there are some additional instructions in the manual about food and the information we need there. Again, this is the area that we struggle with probably the most on this form, and making sure that we have enough detail to really understand what you were spending the money on. And so one thing that can be helpful in you determining this is to look back at your work plan and budget and see what did you call it there and how did you explain it there, and then reflect that in this box on the form. Then you're going to assign a receipt or billing number. And again, this is something that sometimes can be confusing, but it's a number you're going to make up. And so what we suggest is that you start at the top of the expenditure detail form and go starting with 1 in the first item, and then number consecutively down the form. And then you're going to label the corresponding backup with that same number. So for example, if you have a receipt from Pizza Hut for pizzas, and it's the 5th item on your expenditure detail form, it would be number 5 on the form, and then you would find the receipt for Pizza Hut and you would put up at the top of it 5 as well, so that Lori can easily figure out which receipt goes with which line item. It's very helpful if you do that correctly. Again, the example for that is in the manual. And then the final column is what is the receipt amount, and that's the amount you're asking to be reimbursed. Almost always that receipt amount is found on that invoice or receipt, and it matches the amount in the transaction recap. Some districts are claiming the indirect cost rate with their expenditures, meaning you have requested that you be reimbursed your indirect cost rate. We use the federal restricted rate. OSPI publishes that each year, and we update our records to reflect that. If you are claiming that, it will automatically calculate for you on both the EDF, the expenditure detail form, and the A19. Lori set up those templates, so it would automatically do that for you. If you didn't ask to claim the indirect, those boxes will remain blank. So if you're unsure about what your district requested, you can check with Lori. Also, I think I had this conversation with most districts during our negotiation process, but I really encouraged, given our increased match to 75%, I encourage districts to consider submitting their indirect cost rate as match rather than claiming it. And I know in some districts that's just not possible, but that might be something you want to review with your district office to see, because it really is the easiest match on the planet. It's calculated based on your actual expenditures, and then you put it on the monthly match summary form and you send it in, and that's all that you need to do for that match. And for most districts, it can be a few $1,000s. All right, now you've done the transaction recap, you've gathered your documentation, you've completed the expenditure detail form. Now you're going to complete the A19 invoice voucher. And the A19 is just code for the form that the state uses. So again, all the instructions are provided in the coordinator manual for doing this form. We require that original signature be on the form when it's sent to us. Stamped or digital signatures are not allowed. Districts really vary in terms of who their designated authority is to sign that form, so please make sure you know who that is. And then the date on the A19, which is the left side column of that form, matches the date of the expenditure detail form and matches the date of the transaction recap for the month that the expenses were incurred and paid by the district. And thanks to one of our sites for sharing this auditor guidance with us. This came out, I believe, sometime last year, may have even been the year before, but we had some clarification for auditors and what they expect. And they have indicated that school districts must not bill us for expenses that they know are not allowable. So as an example, this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Some of our districts pay a higher meal per diem than we allow, which is the state per diem. And in that situation, the auditor is saying that that district cannot bill us for that higher amount, and that you have to reduce that reimbursement request to the amount that we allow. So the district can pay that higher amount, but they can't bill us for that. What would happen if you did bill us for that higher amount is we would reduce it. So the auditor's opinion was, you know they're not going to reimburse you that higher amount because it's against their rules, so you should reduce it on your A19 and expenditure detail before you even send it in. Then the second auditor guidance is that districts cannot bill WASAC for expenses that the district has not already paid and posted to the transaction detail report. So some of you veterans probably remember that we used to have you bill us for expenses in July, on the July 15th A19 for items that you may not have actually paid for. They were expenses that had been incurred and were pending payments, but you hadn't actually paid them, and we used to have you send those to us anyway. And under the new auditor guidance, we will no longer engage in that practice, and that's reflected in the contracts. We changed that language, and it will change the June and July A19 process for next year so that you're only billing us for expenses that you've actually paid. And so that reminder will go out with our guidance as we prepare for those that process in the end of our fiscal year later in the spring. As I opened with, we talked about your contract is an agreement that you will complete everything in your work plan and your budget that's been approved. However, there is a process to revise both your work plan and your budget. If there is something you'd like to do or money you would like to spend that is not detailed in your budget or your work plan, then you will need to submit a budget and plan revision request. You cannot spend money that is not already approved because we cannot reimburse it. We can't approve things after the fact. And so please be mindful of that. The first budget and work plan revision deadline is December 1st, which is Friday. So it's a good time to review your work plan and budget to see if you're still aligned with what you had planned originally, and go ahead and submit that revision if needed. So anytime you add an activity, add an expense, or delete an activity, you need to let us know. If you're only deleting an expense, we don't need you to do that revision, but if it means that you've also deleted an activity, then you would complete that. And we've revised the instructions to that process a little bit, so you'll want to be sure you review that. A little clarification on budget line items. So each line item description and the assigned budget is an estimate of what you thought you would spend. So it's your best guess of how much things will cost. It's very common that the actual expenses will be higher or lower once you actually complete the activity or the expenditure. And so if that happens, we expect that to happen. We call that managing your overs and unders. And you wouldn't need to do a revision necessarily. But when you are adding a complete new activity or a new expenditure, then you would want to do that revision. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The budget revisions are due. Lori was supposed to kick me under the table if I messed up. So the due date is December 31st, not December 1st, but it's still a good time because that is during your winter break probably, and you might not want to be in working then. So it's still a good time over the next couple of weeks to review everything to see if you need to do a revision. And then again, March 31st and June 30th. The form and the link are there in the slide. And you're going to submit that to me. And again, the instructions have been revised slightly so that you need a building administrator signature, but you can actually send it to me as a coordinator. And you're going to send the form and a revised work plan and budget document. And then we ask that you make all those changes in red so we can find them easily. As a reminder, I know we say this a lot, but it's really important, so we'll keep saying it a lot. GearUp funds can only be used to enhance existing services or add new services, and that's called supplementing. We can't use GearUp funds to replace any existing funds. That's called supplanting. For any federal funding, those are the rules. Supplanting is illegal and would put our grant at risk. So we are very careful about that, and a lot of times I'll ask a lot of questions about activities just to make sure it's really clean and we're not supplanting in any way. And then GearUp funds should also not be used to pay for district responsibilities that are part of normal business. So for example, a textbook adoption is something that school districts do usually regularly. There's usually a schedule. And that would be part of your normal business to make sure that you're using that process. And so GearUp funds shouldn't be used to pay for those things that are just a normal part of your day-to-day work. I do have a new resource in the coordinator manual. I called it an allowable cost quick reference. It probably does not include everything that you might want to spend money on, but it covers the really common things that we see. And so it's a great quick reference about what could be covered and what would not be covered. And so you can use that as a very reliable resource. And if you have an idea that's not on the list and it's not currently in your budget, but you're wondering about it, that's a great time to just ask us questions about whether or not it would be allowable, or you can simply submit the work plan and budget revision request and we can review it through that process. Some final reminders about the reimbursement process. Only goods and services actually received can be reimbursed. So that means if you register for a professional development event and then don't go, we can't reimburse you for that because the service was not received. If you buy tickets to the Pacific Science Center for students to go, we can only reimburse for the students who actually went. If you purchase computers, but you don't actually receive them before the end of the contract cycle, we can't reimburse them. So please be mindful of that. And again, I would refer back to that auditor guidance that you can't ask for reimbursement for something you know that is not allowable. So pay attention to that. And then any of those expenses that are paid by the district for goods or services that were not received are the district's responsibility to pay for. In addition to that, any late fees, test change date fees, penalties, fines, airline change fees, and travel insurance are never allowable, and we cannot make exception to that. That is a really strict state guideline. I think the only time we will pay an airline's change fee, and we have done this, is when you have a staff member resign after the, or change jobs after the flight was booked, and then you want to send a different staff member in their place. We have paid that. That's been the one exception that I can think of. And Lori's nodding in agreement. So that completes the reimbursement process. I'm just going to pause and see if anyone has any questions. All right, someone is asking, can revisions be submitted anytime throughout the year or only for the established due dates? Our preference is definitely that you follow the established due dates. However, you know, things come up, emergencies happen, you find out about things at the last minute. And so, yes, we will always accept them, but if at all possible, we'd like you to stick with the deadlines. When applying a percentage based on attendance for prorating expenditures, for example, for 67 GearUp students and 32 other attendees, would you apply 67.68%, 67%, or 68%? And I think in that case, using the rounded 68% to the whole number is completely acceptable. We're picky, but I don't think we're that picky. Thanks for that question. I'm just going to check one more time to see if I missed any questions. I think that's all of them. So we'll go ahead and move on. I have some kind of general reminders about things. Incentives. Incentives are a big deal. You all, you know, students like incentives. We like you to provide incentives. And I think we covered this at the November workshop, so quick review. If you request incentives from our office, they are free and they don't have to be in your budget. We don't bill you for them. And we're still working on a plan. I got lots of great ideas from everyone about the incentives you'd like to have for your students, so stay tuned. We'll try to figure that out in the next month or two. Then incentives in your budget. So some of you have built that into your budget. Absolutely must always follow the guidance that we have on specific allowable costs. And so if you've been around for a while, you know that is something we definitely pay attention to, and we don't deviate from those approved items or the cost limits. So please take the time to review those before you purchase any incentives. Also, we've made some changes in that area, especially related to food. So that is definitely a document, even if you've been around for a while, you want to review carefully because we did update it this year. Time and effort forms, because this is a federally funded program, there are requirements related to time and effort for anyone paid under the grant, as well as anyone contributing time as match for the program. So all staff paid with GearUp funds must complete a time and effort form. In my experience, districts are used to getting federal funding, so they have an established form and process for that. If for some reason your district does not, we have a sample available here at this link. And then time and effort forms are also required for staff match contributions. And those can be audited both by us and by the state auditor's office. So you want to be sure you're following those rules. We don't collect them, but again, they are a compliance issue, and so you should have those retained with your other GearUp financial records. GearUp inventory, this was a big lesson learned, even better if for us this past grant cycle. And so as a reminder, anything purchased with GearUp funds is GearUp program property. That includes any materials, equipment, furniture, computers, any of that might be purchased during this grant cycle. And then we are going to start asking for an annual inventory to be submitted to us at the end of each contract period. So stay tuned for those instructions. That will likely be a summer task for you coordinators to make sure that's done. But you'll want to put into something now that keeps track of what you purchase with GearUp funds. We do have one consideration for technology. And, you know, we're at middle schools in our cohort schools now. We'll leave the middle schools at the end of next year. And most technology has a 3-year life cycle. So at that point, the middle schools could request to keep those computers or other technologies that's purchased with GearUp funds, but we will have a formal process to do that. And one of the requirements will be that if it's not needed at the high school for those cohort students, then we would likely approve that the technology stay at the middle school. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about making technology purchases or if you're going to request supplemental funding for technology purposes. Some reminders for field trips. All off-campus activities require a field trip approval form. We just put in the bulletin yesterday that transporting students to take the SAT or ACT is not considered a field trip. So you don't need to do one for that event only. And it requires an itinerary. I think we covered this all pretty well at the November workshop. So this is just meant to be a good reminder for you and for the fiscal folks to know that this is a requirement for field trips. The student cash meal allowance form is a really important form. There are lots of ways to pay for meals for students when you're taking them off campus. Those might include your nutrition services program, make a sack lunch for them or sack breakfast. You might go to a restaurant and purchase a meal and pay with one credit card for all the students. You might take them to a college campus and eat in the food service area, or you can give them a cash meal allowance if that's allowed in your school district, and that does vary. If that happens, there is a form that you absolutely must do for all students. You must use our form. Please don't make your own. We will reject that. And students must sign for each meal received. So you can't sign on behalf of students. Other students can't sign on behalf of other students. They must be the students' actual signatures. Then some of you also choose to give that same meal allowance, which is $10 per meal or $15 in King County and $3 for a snack. Some of you choose to give that also to your chaperones or staff rather than giving them per diem. So either one is allowed, but if you give them that meal allowance, then they would have to sign that meal allowance form as well, just like the students. If you then give them per diem, then they would complete your district travel reimbursement form. So you can't just give them cash per diem. They would need to go through your regular district travel process. And when I say chaperones or staff, that would also include family members or other community members that might serve as chaperones. I have a question about that, it looks like. A couple of questions. So the first question is, they sign for each meal received only if they are getting cash, correct? Yes, that's correct. So the cash meal allowance form is only if you are giving cash directly to students or chaperones or staff for meals, and then they would sign for each meal. If you're purchasing the meal on a district credit card, for example, then you do not need them to sign for each meal. That would just show up as a regular expense on your expenditure detail form. The next question, do the field trip and the student cash meal allowance forms need to be submitted with the A19s, or is this kept on file with the district once approved by GearUp? So the cash meal allowance form is your backup for, that serves as your receipt for that cash meal allowance. So it is submitted with your A19. The field trip forms are retained by us and by your coordinators as part of the records and do not need to be submitted. I have a question back to the time and effort documentation. It says middle school staff attendees at GearUp West using hours for match for Sunday, which was a non-contract day, and then there's Monday and Tuesday were actual school days. How should those hours be shown? Are attendance records to the conference enough? We retain those attendance records. As far as I know, you don't have an attendance record unless you keep something separately, but you would submit their match hours on the staff match form, and then per federal guidelines, you should also have that on a time and effort form that you retain. I think that answers that question. If not, please ask me for clarification. Okay, I don't see another request, so we'll move on. College application fees, and I know cohort schools, you're not going to have to worry about this for a while, but priority schools, this is an ongoing process for you. So we have both instructions specific to college application fees and an actual form that's required. So please review both of those pieces. GearUp can pay for up to 3 college application fees per student. Many students, especially in priority schools, do qualify for waivers, and we expect that you use those first. Those usually apply only to 4-year schools. Community colleges typically don't have application fee waivers for students. And we ask that families contribute $15 toward an application fee. So if they're applying to 3 schools, that would be $15 per application fee. But if you determine that even the $15 is a hardship, or in this case, the whole $45 is a hardship, you can waive even that, and there's a space included on the form for that. We ask that you just don't do a blanket exception for every student. If they are able to pay, we'd like them to do that so we can spread the resources out as much as possible. But we trust your judgment on that, and we won't question that if you do sign for the exception to the $15. All right, some reminders about AVID. We have quite a few schools that use or have used GearUp funding toward supporting AVID. So in this grant cycle, I did not award schools any additional funds specific for AVID. A little bit different than what we've done in the past. So if you wanted to support AVID, then you needed to figure out how to do that within your base grant award. Or the supplemental funding request does allow you to request additional funds. We love AVID. We think it's great for students, especially when it becomes a school-wide model. However, a little bit different this time. We won't support any AVID-only activities, and usually that comes up in the form of field trips or celebratory events. So if you want to do something just for AVID, then in our opinion, that is a school responsibility because you've opted to adopt AVID. Of course, AVID students can participate in other activities. We're not excluding those students, but we don't want to see just the AVID class going on a college visit or another field trip, for example. So please think about that. I probably will ask some questions about that for field trip requests occasionally, so don't be alarmed by that. I have a question that says, this includes the AVID Summer Institute. Correct, I did not award additional funds for AVID Summer Institute. If you wanted that, then you needed to include that in your planning with the base award. But it is one of the options for the supplemental funding request that I sent out last week. So if you didn't fund it in your base award, or if you'd like to reassign those funds and ask for additional money for AVID, then you can do that. Couple of more reminders. If you want GearUp to pay for the Summer Institute, you are expected to attend the Seattle session, which is July 10th to the 12th. This is the first time ever that it's been offered in Seattle. We're really excited. We've been asking them to do that for 10 years. So we're happy they finally were able to make it happen. If your district, for any reason, opts to attend any other session, like in California or Texas or wherever, then we will expect your district to pay for the flights because it is a higher cost, or the difference in the cost to attend. So if you think for some reason you're going to have to attend another session, then I would ask that you probably talk to me about that as soon as possible so we can figure out what GearUp can pay for. Also, we are a conservative program and we'll pay for that early bird registration only. Anything after that we typically do not pay for. So please pay attention to those registration deadlines. And then Lori will send out full guidance about AVID and the expenses that we'll cover prior to the registration deadline. So watch for that. Other professional development updates. GearUp can pay for professional development for current or future teachers of the cohort. So one of our hopes is that in these early years of the grant cycle, especially for cohort schools, is that we continue to engage high school teachers who will serve our students starting in years 3 and above in this grant cycle. So we encourage you to invite them to our workshops. We encourage you to include them in other professional development you might be offering so that when our students arrive at the high school, they are ready for them and understand GearUp and what we are all working toward. Other ProDev that you might offer should support GearUp goals and objectives, and they all should be entered into the portal like we discussed on Monday. In general, out-of-state travel for ProDev is not an allowable expense, so I do not support conferences in Florida or Idaho, I'm sorry, not Idaho, Iowa or any other state. You'll need to find other funds to support that. However, the state recognizes Oregon and Idaho, and actually even British Columbia, as in-state travel, so that would be allowable per state rules. Then, if travel is required, please note all the rules for return and departure times, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So travel is probably the most difficult thing for our school partners to understand and to follow the rules because quite often it is different than what your district allows or the process that they use. And it's probably where Lori spends most of her time doing follow-up for the A19 reimbursement process. So as I said, I updated the travel guidelines again with Lori's support and help last week. So those are hot off the press and posted to the coordinator manual section on our website. Please print it, read it, share it. Make sure that you understand it, ask questions if needed. Please pay special attention to the rules about meal periods and eligibility for reimbursement and the documentation that's required. WASAC has very defined meal periods that determine whether or not you're eligible for a meal reimbursement, and we cannot make exceptions to that. And that is why we ask that you document your depart and return times. And again, I'm going to address that a little bit more. Every October 1, the state updates the state per diem map, and that can be found on our coordinator manual as well, so please reference that. And then as we discussed, out-of-state travel is generally not allowable. As I said, depart and return times are critical because it's the only way we can determine meal eligibility, and we have defined meal periods, and we cannot make exception to those. Starting immediately, if your travel form does not include depart and return times, then the meals requested will automatically be deducted because there's no way we can determine whether or not you are eligible for them or other staff. Then Lori will notify you that it's been deducted, and it will be up to you or the person doing your A19 to correct the form and resubmit it on the next A19. Why are we doing that? Well, as I said, Lori's spending considerable time doing follow-up on this issue specifically, and we feel that since it's been a requirement for 5 years, we feel like y'all should be on board with us now, and we really just need you to figure out a way to comply with this request so that it reduces the follow-up time needed for all of us. So you'll start noticing that if you don't have depart and return times on your travel form, you can include it on the expenditure detail form, or we just suggest that you possibly consider revising your travel form so it's included and a required box that is filled in by staff. I know that seems a little harsh for us. We try to be as flexible as possible, but again, it's just taking too much of our time to process those, and it's causing delays in reimbursement. So that's where we are. I hope you understand, and I hope that you find an easy way to make that work for you. As I said earlier, we have some guidance specifically about food, and that's on this link of the specific allowable costs and guidelines. It talks about healthy snacks, and we really mean that. We want kids, their brains to be ready for work, and so we want them to have healthy food. However, we do allow the occasional candy or other treat as an incentive, and it's limited to $1 per student per year or 1 activity per quarter. And so it's for a rare and very specific purpose, and so it gives you some examples in that guidance. However, if you're really committed to having treats more often, then we suggest that you try to get donations from the local grocer or from someone else in the community. We certainly wouldn't stop you from doing that, and you're welcome to get donations for anything for your program at any time, and it's a great match. After-school snacks or other food are not an allowable expense for us ever. All of your schools are at least 50% free and reduced lunch eligible, and so that makes it possible for your school nutrition services program to provide snacks for your after-school program. And if you need information on that, you can let us know, but I believe there's also a link in the coordinator manual for that information. All right, that was a lot of detail on some items that we thought needed extra attention. I'm just going to pause to see if you have any questions, and then we'll get into match. All right, it must have been crystal clear. I don't see any questions. So moving on to match. Oh, so there is a whole section dedicated in the coordinator manual for match. So again, please read it. There's the link. And then for those of you who are less familiar with the term match, it is the cash share contribution by the school district to support GearUp students. but it may be in the form of services, donations, staff time, volunteers, or goods provided to the program. So it doesn't necessarily always mean cash. Someone out there is paying for it in some way, but it may not actually be an additional cost to your district, but it's time, or what we call in kind, that is contributed to the program. The requirement for this current contract period is 75% of your actual expenditures. So in the event that you spend less than your whole grant award this year, it would be 75% of what you actually spend. The match period matches the expenditure contract period, which is October 1 to August 31st. Other federal funds can never be used as match, so that includes things like Title I, which is federal funding, or AmeriCorps programs, which is federal funding, and even military contributions. So if you have military recruiters come out, their time cannot be counted as match because they are paid with federal funds. Your match must be submitted monthly with the A19, so they should come in one package together. And then there is a monthly match summary form and all of the other forms, again, on the coordinator manual. If it's not submitted with the A19, then your reimbursement will be withheld until we have the match for that same corresponding month. When you're submitting match for school staff, so that's anyone that is employed and paid by your school district, there is a specific form, and you should include the actual hourly salary plus the benefits for that position for any time spent supporting GearUp students and families in the program in general. And so there are different categories of folks in districts. I think these categories cover most everyone. And there are some distinctions here about how you can count match. So for administrators, that includes principals, assistant principals, dean of students, superintendents, usually anyone in the district office. All their time supporting the program can be counted as match and should be counted as match. For counselors, this one's a little bit tricky, and it's not an answer I can provide for you. But if they are considered part of the administrator pool, all of their time can count as match if they're supporting GearUp activities. If they are part of the certificated or teacher pool, then only their time beyond the contract time day can be counted. Again, that's not an answer I can give you. You need to consult with your district business office to figure out which category your counselors fall into. Teachers, only their time beyond the contract day can count. GearUp staff, your time can count if it's beyond the time you're getting paid. And I know many of you volunteer extra time to make this job work, so that can be counted. Classified staff, absolutely all the time spent supporting the program can be counted. Then substitutes, if they're not being paid by GearUp, can count. But keep in mind, for all of the above, if any of their time is paid with federal funds, it can't be counted as match. So say someone is paid half time with Title I and half time with general ed dollars, and they're a classified staff. If they're volunteering for GearUp during that classified staff time that's not federally funded, you could still count them, but you couldn't count any of that Title I time as match. I have a question. The match form does not also serve as time and effort. We must also have them sign a time and effort form. And unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. They are two very different forms for different purposes, and you would need to do both. All right, we also have a form for other volunteers. So these are anyone else, so anyone who is not employed by the school or paid by the school would complete a different form, and it's called the match form for goods and services. We struggle a lot to get this form filled out completely, so please pay attention that all of the boxes are completed before you send it in to us. If it's not complete, we will have to return it to you, and then you can get it completed and resubmit. So please pay attention to that. Original signatures are required on that form, and please note that it cannot be edited by anyone other than the donor. So we will correct calculation errors. You don't really need to worry about that. You can do that, but we always do that as well, so that can be a time saver for you. But please don't add information to the form. If they didn't write in the travel time, then you can't add that even if you know it happened. So you'll want to just take the time to make sure the donor is completing the form accurately and completely so that we can accept all of the match that is documented there. We have struggled with that a little bit in the last couple years. So that's an area where we'd like to see you spending a little bit more time and just being a little more cautious to make sure the form is completed by the donor. When calculating match rates for volunteers, there are a few different options. The current volunteer rate is actually quite high for Washington. It's $30.04. And so if you have a volunteer who does not provide their salary or isn't comfortable sharing it with you, or maybe they just don't really know what their hourly rate with benefits is, they can choose to leave that blank. And if they leave it blank, you must use the $30.04. So that would be true even if you knew absolutely they made $75 an hour. If they don't fill it in, then you have to put in the $30.04. And you use that when they're at your school doing their regular job. So whatever their regular job is, if that's how they're helping you at school with Gear Up, then that's the rate you would use if they don't provide it. However, they can use, and if they do use, their actual salary and benefits, then you need to leave that in. So if their regular job pays them plus benefits $15.49, then you have to leave it at that. You can't change it to $30.04, and you shouldn't change it in any other way. And if they don't know their benefits, it is okay to estimate that at 35% of their salary. So if they make $15 an hour, you'd add 35% onto that for salary and benefits. And you can talk to them about that and coach them through that amount to fill in on the form. That would be acceptable. Excuse me. So there are lots of types of volunteers who might be helping your program, and those would include some guest speakers that volunteer their time, college campus staff that come and visit students on your campus and provide advising, any college or career fair presenters. You might have tutors or mentors that come in from the community, or even student volunteers, teacher volunteers, after hours. All of those folks are considered volunteers. And then your advisory committee members are also volunteers. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list of who might be a volunteer on behalf of your program, but it gives you a start. And then as a reminder, as we said earlier, those paid with federal funds can't be used as matched no matter what they're doing. And it seems that every year I do get questions about AmeriCorps members because they might be seen as a volunteer beyond the school day. And this is just happens to be a place that I know something about. I'm on the AmeriCorps Commission for the state and have been an AmeriCorps program director. And so AmeriCorps program members really are considered a full-time, all-the-time member. So they're not 8-hour-a-day positions. So even if they put in 15 hours, you can't count any of their time as volunteer time, because when they sign up to serve in AmeriCorps, it's much like the military in that they are a 24/7 volunteer. So I hope that helps understanding for that. Then you also use that match contribution of goods and services form anytime your school or others donate goods or more stuff to the program. Receipts might be required for those items. Most of the time we will ask you for a receipt that documents the actual cost or value of that donation. But we recognize that sometimes that isn't possible. So things like swag donated by colleges, if they bring all the students a pen, for example, we're not going to ask that the college provide you a receipt for that pen, but the cost should be reasonable. So, you know, a pen's usually a couple of bucks. If we see you saying the pens are $10, we're going to probably know that the college didn't spend $10 on a pen that they're giving away to a student. So just making sure that that's a reasonable documentation of whatever was actually donated is a good idea. Then we have brand new guidance this year on the use of space as match. So please refer to that. We've had some really complicated guidance in the past that really meant we had one district that was able to use space as match, and there's been a little bit of a shift federally on this guidance as well, so we felt comfortable revising this. So you can use your district established rates that would be charged to other programs or community groups for space usage, and you can document that on the Goods and Services Match Contribution Form monthly and then submit that district rate sheet as backup. So if you're using the gym for a family event for 2 hours, and normally the district would charge a group $50 an hour, and that's on the rate sheet that you can provide us, then it's completely justifiable to submit that $100 as match. If you get the custodian service for free because you're in the school, but a community group might be charged $25 an hour for that custodian rate, then you can also include that. So those are things that are easily missed, but in the 75% rate goal, they'll be really important things to remember to document. So we're hoping that that will be helpful to all of you in adding some additional match that maybe you haven't been able to count on in the past. Some other easily missed match opportunities include the telephones that you use. There is a cost to those, a monthly cost. Consumable supplies. So if you're not purchasing consumable supplies or you need additional supplies that aren't in your budget, finding a way to document that usage can be added to that match contribution of goods and services form. Printing charges, office photocopiers, furniture and technology. As you probably know, we don't usually purchase furniture for our gearup programs, but it's provided by the district and there is a value in that. Mostly we buy technology that our gearup staff need, but sometimes districts provide that. Again, there's a value to that. Any IT support that's provided for any technology that gearup purchases or uses could be used as match. And then almost always when you're planning a field trip, the school nurse and or food service prep folks might be involved, and their time is a good match to document as well. And we have about 9 slides left, so we're almost done. Thanks for hanging in there with us. I appreciate it. Please remember that we ask that you provide an annual staff match training to all of your school staff, teachers and classified and others, whatever category they might fall into. We have a really good outline for that training, so we've created that step by step so you know what needs to be covered. And then once you've done that, we want that entered into the professional development section of the portal so that we know you completed that requirement. Are there any questions about match? The question, can you bank match? For example, we brought several teachers to the conference on Sunday, and that was a non-contract day. We'll probably have more match than 75% this month. Yeah, okay, that's a great couple of questions, actually. I would not consider, so you should document the Sunday time as match for the conference, absolutely. You can also document the travel time that it took you to get to Gearup West and home. That is time that those folks donated that they would not have worked usually. And so that can be all documented as match. However, we don't look at match on a month-to-month basis. So if you spend $100 in October, I'm not looking for $75 worth of match necessarily. You're going to document the match that you have each month. And what we look at is over the contract cycle, did you meet the match overall? So from October 1 to August 31st, did you meet the 75% requirement? There might be some months that you exceed the 75% of your expenditures. There might be some months that you are under that. So we look at the entire contract cycle to make sure you hit that 75%. It's really common in the past for our schools to overmatch over the course of the contract year, which turns out to be a good thing. We will always take whatever match you actually have in a year, and then at the end of each year, we do an analysis of how did we do as a program overall in meeting our dollar-for-dollar match requirement that we have. And that is why in past grant cycles, we've been able to, over time, reduce the match requirement. So as an example, in Grant 3, in the first year, we had a 60% match requirement, and by year 6, we had a 33% match requirement, because schools did a great job documenting match and overmatching in most years. So by the end, we didn't really need that much match. And so we will continue that. We'll keep the 75% requirement this year. We'll reassess next year. And if there's at any time we're feeling comfortable with where we are, we will reduce that match, which reduces paperwork burden on all of you. I have a question. Does the time from our district business office count as match? Almost always, yes. However, if you are claiming indirect on your expenditures, meaning we're reimbursing you for indirect expenses as well, you need to make sure that those district office folks aren't included in that district indirect cost rate. So again, that's something I cannot answer for you. You'd need to discuss with those folks in the office that are familiar with how that rate is calculated and who's included. Now pause just for a second. Another question about time and effort. Do you need a GearUp time and effort, hours worked by a calendar day timesheet, or similar district document for administrators who do not regularly complete a timesheet if the administrator has match hours? Yes, we do. So that's very similar to what we do here in our office. We all sign time and effort based on actual hours. So for our director who splits his time across multiple programs, he does a daily record of his actual GearUp time for his time and effort form. So short answer is yes. Another question about, oops, sorry about that. I cannot write, just a clarification, I cannot write in the volunteer rate for them and then calculate it based on their responses for hours. You need to give them the opportunity to fill out, so we're talking about community volunteers. You can give them the opportunity to fill in their actual rate, salary plus benefits, or their hourly rate plus benefits. But if they choose not to, you can fill in the volunteer rate. However, you can also coach them through that and say they can use their actual or they can use the 3004. So you can definitely talk to them about the options for filling out that form, but once they determine what rate they're going to fill in, if they fill it in, you have to leave it at that. If they leave it blank and just give you the form filled out and signed, then you can add the $30.04 in. Oh, I keep clicking. Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong page. One more question. What about office space? Yes, You can use that as match. I'll go back to that slide for just a second. You can use school space as match, including office space, if your district has a standard rate that they would charge other outside entities or other programs for that space. I have a question about what if student supplies were provided by the school in September? So that would not be considered match because your contract period started October 1st. So you can only count as match anything that happened October 1st through August 31st for this year. Do you need to prorate match for school space? For example, the gym is being used for 2 hours at a match rate of $100. If 50% of the participants were Gear Up, would the match be $50 or $100? I would say in that case, no, you would not need to prorate it because the cost would be $100 no matter who participated. So remember, and I think this will come up in some of our examples in a few minutes, that if the cost is the same, whether other students participate or not, then we would count that as an expenditure, which means it would also be allowable match. Good question. Can we put October and November match on the same summary form? No, it should, each month should be done separately because we do track by the month, so we ask that you separate those out, and October be on one, November be on one, December be on a separate one, on and on. Thanks for checking. All right, it looks like we're caught up on questions. So I'm going to just go through some examples. So I'm going to do cohort examples first, and then we'll do some priority examples. And I really encourage you, I'm going to do these really quickly because I recognize we're nearly out of time. So I encourage you to go back to these slides once we send them out and make sure it's really clear to you. So for cohort schools, you can only spend money on the class of 2023. Always, always, always. There are no exceptions to that for you cohort schools. And you can only pay for expenses that are specifically incurred as a result of Gear Up. Any staff pay must support that class of 2023 implementing Gear Up activities. So your schools can't assign you to do recess or lunchroom duties or other things that they might just be might be really common for them to assign to other folks. 100% of your time must be spent to support the Gear Up program. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be in the lunchroom doing Gear Up work. You can definitely do that, and it's quite common for schools to connect with students during that lunch break. So that's completely okay. But you can't be in there just providing general supervision, for example. So if any of you have difficulty with that, I ask that you please let me know so we can address that as quickly as possible. Similarly, if you have a coaching position in addition to your Gear Up role, any time that you leave early for a game, for example, cannot be billed to Gear Up, so that would need to be charged. So if you are the basketball coach and once a week you're leaving at 2 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock, then that time cannot be paid by Gear Up. So please, again, let me know if that's the situation and we can just figure out a way to work around that. If you do opt to include other students as a cohort school, most of the time those other costs must be provided by another funding source, including the staff time. Again, like we just said though, if there's no additional cost, then it is okay for those other students to participate. If your cohort is larger than a bus load, which I said 60 here, but really it's more like 40 with big kids, then you're expected to fill the bus with cohort students. So we wouldn't want to see a bus with 20 cohort students and 30 non-cohort students, and Gear Up would not be able to pay the full cost in that situation. We would absolutely expect you to prorate it. So it's important to think about your intention and if your intention is to serve other students, then that takes a little bit of extra work just to figure out what's allowable with GearUp and what would another source need to fund. And that's always a great question for Lori, and she's really good at helping you work through those situations. So we appreciate it when folks are proactive and say, here's what I'm thinking, you know, what would GearUp be able to pay for and what do I need to fund in another way? Excuse me. Here are some examples for bus costs specific to cohort students. So you have 100 students, you're going to go on a field trip, you can get 80 kids on a bus, and you had 70 GearUp students sign up. And so there's room to take 10 additional kids. The key here is that all those 100 students were invited to go, only 70 wanted to go, and so you're going to pay for those 2 buses no matter what. So taking those 10 students that are not GearUp, it's not going to cost you any money, additional money for the bus cost, so we would pay for those buses. There might be other expenses for those 10 students like food that you would need to have other funding for. In another example, you have the same 100 students and you're going to take 40 of them on a field trip, and you want to take 40 8th graders along. In that case, you would have to get that second bus, and so we would only pay for that first bus. Then in the last example, you have 40 science students you're taking on a field trip. Again, you need 1 bus, but only 10 of the students are actually GearUp. So maybe you're taking, you know, all the science students and only 10 are actually GearUp. Then in that case, we would only pay for 25% of that bus because the intention was all science students in 7th and 8th grade and not just GearUp science students. Looks like I have a question. If there is a program like Challenge Applications that have a base fee, may we offer to all the classes? So yeah, that's a great example, Anne, of when the price would be the price no matter how many students you participate. There's no additional cost to include additional students, so GearUp would pay that full expense. And again, if you're ever wondering about those specific situations, it's a great time to ask Lori a question. Then we have really similar examples for cohort schools and food costs. I would say just review these. They do align with the same logic that the bus logic that we just went through. So just double check that. For priority school expenditures, the rules are a little bit different because your model is different. So you're currently serving GearUp eligible students in grades 7 through 12. And so there is that eligibility verification process. And so you've identified who is GearUp eligible, and those are the students you can spend money on. And they have to be GearUp related expenses and in your budget. Same rules apply. Staff time being paid for by GearUp must directly serve GearUp students, can't be spent doing recess or lunch duty or other things outside of your GearUp work plan. And if you include other students, the related expenses may be, you may need to find another source. As always, the intention is the important consideration. So here the examples are really similar, but what we're usually looking for, because you're small schools, is that the majority of students are GearUp and that you pay, then we can pay for those bus expenses. If you're only taking GearUp students, but there's room on the bus, then you can take other students with these considerations. So as an example, you're going to take students to the Washington State History Museum. You're going to take your Washington State History students. Some of them are GearUp eligible, some of them are not. In this example specifically, the majority are not. You had 12 GearUp eligible students and 18 non-GearUp eligible students. So in that case, GearUp is not the majority. We would expect you to prorate that bus cost accordingly. Then another example, you have a senior study activity on a Saturday. So you're inviting all of your seniors, and 10 are GearUp eligible and 5 aren't. and you want to provide them food while they're studying, and so we would expect you to split the food accordingly, proportionately to the number of actual students who show up. So there are many examples when we can pay for everything, but there are certainly examples when we would expect you to prorate things. So are there any questions about those details? None of that is new. None of that logic is new. So if you've been with us for a while, you should be pretty comfortable with that idea. If it's new to you, really just let us know if that was confusing, because it does take a while to kind of get used to that logic. It's a little bit different than what you're probably used to. And Lori is your best resource for that. So I did release the supplemental funding request. I just realized I didn't update this after I did that, but I did release the supplemental funding request. And so that went out to coordinators and principals last week. There's very specific guidance about what is allowable. Yeah, I think the due date was actually the 29th because the 31st is a Sunday. So that should read, and I'll correct this before I send it out, but it's due December 29th. You will need to spend the funds by August 31st, and it must be submitted by the building administrator. Then please note, if you are a new priority school, so that means North Beach or Davenport, or a cohort school, then you will have to match at 75% any supplemental funding request that you receive. If you are a returning priority school, you will not have to have any match for the supplemental funding request. And that's just because I have two different pools of money that I'm drawing from to make this possible. And so that's what I can offer. I apologize to the schools that have to have match for it, but that's the best I can do. So please review that guidance. There are a lot of resources included. It's a little bit different than supplemental funding requests that we've done in the past. And if you have questions, definitely let me know. And finally, as I hope I said 100,000 times, if you have questions about A19 or match, please ask Lori. She should be your first point of contact when thinking about is something aligned with your budget, or do you have questions about that process? If you're looking to do budget revisions, then that should come to me first, and I will address those. So we're trying to streamline those questions a little bit so that Lori is the first point of contact for most things. So that completes today's webinar. And as I said, I'll send out the link to the recording, hopefully by the end of today, but if not, definitely by tomorrow, and we'll send out the slides as well, and then we will put them in the bulletin as well for next week. Please, we did not have a lot of fiscal contacts participate today. Please make sure you are sending this information and sharing this information, talking about it with your building and or district business office, as this is usually most important to those folks. So thank you for being their representatives today, and thank you for participating, and I will now end the recording.